So today, I want to talk about something that I genuinely believe is the most important story nobody is covering properly right now. Every journalist, every analyst, every cable news panel is laser focused on the same question. Who is winning between America and Iran? Is Trump achieving his objectives? Is Iran going to hold the Strait of Hormuz closed? Will ground troops go in? These are real questions and they matter. But here's the thing. They are all looking at the wrong country. Because right now, while America and Iran are grinding each other down, there is a third country sitting on the sidelines, not firing a single missile, not spending a single dollar on bombs, not losing a single soldier, and getting stronger every single day this war continues. And I want to walk you through exactly how that is possible. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That country is China. Now, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, okay, China is not even in this fight. How can a country win a war it is not participating in? And that is precisely the right question to ask. Because the answer reveals something fundamental about the difference between how China thinks about power and how America thinks about power. America has what I call the hammer approach. There is a problem, you hit it. You hit it with maximum force, maximum speed, maximum firepower. This is why the military-industrial complex has such a stranglehold on American foreign policy. Boeing needs contracts. Lockheed needs contracts. Raytheon needs contracts. And bombs are very good for contracts. China's approach comes from a different tradition entirely. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War roughly 2,500 years ago. And the central lesson of that entire book is this one sentence. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Read that again, slowly. The greatest victory is to win without fighting at all. You do not waste your soldiers. You do not drain your treasury. You do not expose your weaknesses on a battlefield. Instead, you position yourself so that by the time you make your move, the outcome is already settled. This is not ancient philosophy sitting in a museum somewhere. This is an operating manual, and Beijing is following it right now with extraordinary precision. So let me show you the mechanics of this. Let me show you what China actually gains in each direction this war can go. Scenario 1, America wins completely. The bombs work, the regime collapses. Washington installs a government in Tehran it can work with. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. The nuclear program is gone. America achieves every stated objective. Does China lose in this scenario? Think about it carefully before you answer. Because most people say yes, instinctively, and most people are wrong. Here is what actually happens to China if America wins this war. Nothing catastrophic. And here is why. To win this war, even in the best case, America will have burned through an enormous pile of borrowed money. We already know the Pentagon told Congress the first 6 days of Operation Epic Fury cost approximately $11.3 billion. By day 39, analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated total military expenditure at roughly $28 billion. And that number keeps climbing. Now, consider the context that money is being spent in. America's national debt has crossed $36 trillion. The federal government is currently borrowing money just to cover the interest payments on debt it already owes. Every single bomb dropped in Iran is a bomb paid for on a credit card that future Americans will be paying off. Who holds a large portion of that debt? China holds over $1 trillion in American treasury bonds. When America goes deeper into debt to fund a war, it prints more dollars, dilutes the value of existing currency, and transfers real purchasing power away from dollar holders toward whoever is positioned in harder assets. China has been quietly moving out of dollar-denominated reserves and into gold, commodities, and yuan-denominated trade agreements for years. The more America spends on war, the weaker its financial foundation becomes. A financially weaker America is not a loss for China. It is a structural advantage. China does not need to defeat America. It only needs America to keep spending faster than it can sustain. And there is something even more pointed here. America's military-industrial complex is not designed to produce efficient outcomes. It is designed to produce expensive ones. An F-35 fighter jet costs roughly $400 million per aircraft and took 26 years to develop. The Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, at $13 billion, had to pull back from the Persian Gulf within weeks of arriving because the threat environment made its position untenable. The Patriot missile defense system cost billions to operate, and Iranian drones costing $50,000 have repeatedly exposed gaps in its coverage. Where does all that money go? To Boeing, to Lockheed Martin, to Raytheon, to the shareholders and executives and lobbyists whose entire financial model depends on continuous, expensive, inconclusive military engagement. This is the machine that launched this war. And every month it keeps running is a month that America falls further behind in the economic competition that will actually determine the century. So scenario 1, America wins in Iran. China loses 0 soldiers, spends 0 on the war, watches America spend another 20 or 30 or 50 billion dollars it borrowed, and inherits a more financially exhausted competitor. That is not a loss for China. That is a slow gift. Now, scenario 2, and this is where it gets genuinely consequential. America fails to achieve its objectives. Iran does not collapse. The regime survives. America is eventually forced to negotiate, to retreat, to accept something other than what it came for. This is not a hypothetical. Looking at where things stand on the 10th of April, 2026, this is the trajectory. In this scenario, something much larger than a military outcome starts to crack, something that China has been targeting for over a decade. Let me explain the petrodollar system, because without understanding it, you cannot understand what is actually at stake here. In 1973, America made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. America agreed to protect the Saudi regime because every country on earth needs oil, and oil could only be purchased in dollars. Every country on earth was forced to hold dollars in reserve. This created artificial, permanent global demand for the American currency. This is why America can print money, run deficits that would destroy any other country's currency and finance its military empire without the normal constraints of economic reality. This is the exorbitant privilege that French economists complained about in the 1960s. America gets to pay its bills in a currency only it can print, and the rest of the world has to earn that currency by selling real goods and services. Now, look at what is happening at the Strait of Hormuz right now. Iran shut down a waterway that carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. And then Iran started doing something that nobody in Washington expected. When ships want to pass through, Iran is demanding payment in Chinese yuan, not dollars. Yuan. Deutsche Bank put out a note to clients last month calling this potentially significant. Their strategists wrote that this conflict could be remembered as a key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance and the beginnings of the petroyuan. Think about what it means when one of the world's most established financial institutions is sending that assessment to institutional investors. China's Ministry of Commerce confirmed last week that yuan-denominated oil payments through the strait are taking place. Harvard economist Kenneth Rogoff, a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, told Al Jazeera that Iran is dead serious about preferring yuan to cultivate its relationship with China and to avoid American sanctions. Every tanker that pays in yuan instead of dollars is a small withdrawal from the reservoir of global dollar demand that props up American financial power. Individually, each transaction is a drop, but this is how tidal shifts begin. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with 1,000 quiet transactions adding up until the direction becomes undeniable. And the dollar's position was already weakening before any of this started. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell to roughly 57% last year. That is the lowest level since the International Monetary Fund began tracking the data in 1995. Central banks around the world have been diversifying quietly and consistently for years. This war just accelerated the process. Now, I want to talk about Russia for a moment, because this story has a third beneficiary that almost nobody is including in their analysis. Before this war started, Russia was in serious fiscal trouble. Oil export earnings had collapsed. The Kremlin was privately preparing cuts to non-security spending across multiple departments. Putin was, in the words of one analyst, essentially pawning the country to keep the war machine in Ukraine running. Then America launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz closed, Gulf crude supplies dried up. Importing nations scrambled for alternative sources. Russian Urals crude jumped from $44 per barrel in February to $77 in March, its highest level since October 2023. Reuters calculated that Russia's main oil extraction tax will generate approximately $9 billion in April alone, up from around $4 billion in March. According to the KSC Institute, if this conflict lasts 3 months, Russia could collect an additional $161 billion in export revenues compared to a no-war baseline. That is roughly $500 million a day flowing into Moscow from an energy crisis that Washington created. Russia did not fire a shot in this war. Russia did not spend $1 on it. Russia did not risk a single diplomatic relationship over it. And Russia is collecting a windfall that has, in the words of one analyst, allowed Putin to postpone planned cuts and stop pawning the country. America launched a war to weaken Iran. The collateral effect is that it handed Russia a financial lifeline at exactly the moment Russia needed one most. This is what happens when you think in terms of the hammer and not in terms of consequences. Let me now bring in the historical dimension, because this pattern is not new. It has played out before with almost mathematical precision. The Peloponnesian War ran from 431 to 404 before the Common Era. Athens was the financial and commercial power of the Greek world. Sparta was the military power. They went to war and fought each other for 27 years. Both sides spent everything they had. Athens, the stronger power at the start, was completely broken. Sparta won, but was so depleted it could not sustain dominance. And who collected the price? Not Athens, not Sparta, Macedonia. A kingdom to the north that everyone had dismissed as a backwater, Philip of Macedon watched the two great powers grind each other into dust. He built his army. He modernized his economy. He made alliances quietly. When Athens and Sparta were both exhausted, he moved. Within a single generation, his son Alexander controlled the entire Greek world and was pushing into Persia. America is Athens in this analogy. Iran is Sparta, and China is Macedonia. Watching, building, waiting. Now go forward to the First World War. Britain and Germany, the two dominant industrial powers on earth, went to war in 1914. 4 years later, Britain had technically won. But Britain came out of the war so deeply indebted that it had to borrow from the country it had just defeated. Germany was crushed, and who emerged from the rubble as the world's leading creditor nation and dominant financial power? America, a country that entered the war late, absorbed far fewer casualties than the European combatants, and used the disruption to permanently replace Britain at the top of the global order. 30 years after that war ended, the dollar had replaced the pound sterling as the world reserve currency. The British Empire was dissolving. American dominance was complete. China is following the same playbook today that America followed then. Let the established powers exhaust each other. Build your own capacity quietly. Absorb the talent, the trade relationships, the institutional influence that flows toward the rising power when the dominant power is too distracted and too stretched to hold everything together. Let me show you concretely what China is actually doing while this war burns. While Washington was launching strikes on February 28th, Beijing was finalizing the 15th five-year plan at the National People's Congress in early March. This is a comprehensive, heavily researched, nationally coordinated development blueprint covering technology, manufacturing, energy, infrastructure, and education for the next 5 years. China will increase national research and development spending by approximately 7% annually, with particular focus on advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, sixth-generation wireless technology, and green energy systems. At the same moment, China accelerated what analysts at the Stimson Center describe as a dual-track strategy of multi-source energy procurement combined with accelerated renewable energy development. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz exposed the vulnerability of concentrated supply chains. China's response was not panic. China's response was to use the crisis as justification to move faster on the energy independence agenda it already had. In Africa, a landmark agreement valued at $18 billion was finalized in early 2026, involving Chinese firms and renewable energy projects in Morocco and Egypt. China is building solar installations, wind farms, and manufacturing bases across North Africa. At the same moment, America is dropping bombs in the Persian Gulf. And in terms of Belt and Road investment overall, Chinese overseas investment in these projects surged 62% last year compared to 2024, exceeding $85 billion. To be clear about the scale of what that means, America spent $28 billion bombing Iran over 40 days. China spent $85 billion building infrastructure and relationships across the developing world in a single year. One approach buys enemies, the other buys partners. Now, I want to be straight with you about something, because intellectual honesty is what separates real analysis from propaganda. China is not winning this war in every dimension. There are genuine costs and genuine risks for Beijing. China was importing approximately 1.4 million barrels of Iranian oil per day by the end of 2025. That supply has been severely disrupted. Standard economic modeling suggests China's GDP falls roughly 0.5% for every 25% rise in oil prices. The property market crisis and weak domestic consumption already have the Chinese economy under strain. If this conflict tips Europe and America into deep recession, Chinese export demand collapses as well. And the $400 billion investment commitment China made to Iran through the 20-25-year strategic partnership now sits inside a country being systematically bombed. These are real complications. Anyone telling you China is the perfect winner in every direction is not being honest with you. But here is the question you have to answer honestly. Who is bearing the greater costs in this conflict right now? China is managing energy supply chain disruptions and dealing with the complications of a damaged partner. America is spending $28 billion and counting, losing service members, watching oil prices devastate household budgets, and becoming more deeply embedded in the Middle East at the exact moment its strategic interests demand it be focused on the Pacific. China's costs in this war are the cost of a country dealing with economic turbulence it did not cause. America's costs are the cost of a country that chose to start something it has not yet figured out how to finish. That asymmetry is the whole argument. Here is what I want you to hold on to after you finish watching this. In 1918, when World War I ended, nobody in London or Berlin was talking about America's rise. They were too busy arguing about reparations and boundaries and who had won. Meanwhile, America had quietly become the world's largest creditor nation. The conversation about who dominated the 20th century had already been answered. Most people just did not realize it yet. History is not written only by those who fight the loudest battles. It is written by those who are disciplined enough to let others exhaust themselves, patient enough to build during the chaos, and perceptive enough to recognize the exact moment their preparation meets the opportunity created by everyone else's destruction. America is fighting this war. Iran is surviving this war. And China is building the world that comes after it. Sun Tzu wrote that the greatest victory is to win without fighting. 2,500 years later, one country has read that book carefully, and it is not the one dropping the bombs. That is what I think you need to understand about this war. Not just who is winning right now, but who will be writing the history of it 30 years from now. Think about that.